Anyway, let me introduce our speaker. Brendan Englund is an assistant professor at the Stevens Institute of Technology in the Mechanical Engineering Department, where he directs the Robust Field Autonomy Lab. The lab focuses on robust autonomous navigation solutions for robots operating in harsh and unstructured environments, including both land-based and underwater applications. I should add that Stevens is situated right on the Hudson River and has direct access to that river, and Brendan's research is related to underwater robots, as I indicated. After he received his PhD at MIT in 2012, he worked at the United Technologies Research Center in East Hartford, Connecticut, where he was a research scientist and principal investigator in the Autonomous and Intelligent Robotics Laboratory there, and a technical contributor to the Sikorsky Autonomous Research Aircraft. He joined the faculty at Stevens in 2014 and subsequently received the NSF Career Award in 2017. He is presently an associate editor for the IEEE Journal in Oceanic Engineering. So without further ado, Professor Englund.
Thank you, Max, and thanks everyone for joining for the seminar today. Although much of the research that I do at Stevens looks at mobile robot platforms across different domains, land, air, and sea, we'll be talking about some of the algorithms we're working on today geared specifically toward ground vehicles. And what you see here is kind of an example of our goal to achieve minimalistic autonomous navigation that can be lightweight, computationally efficient, and also require small, low-cost number of sensors. So our lab, however, has a wide scope. We look at mobile robot platforms in different domains, as I mentioned. So just to give you an idea, here on the left we have some of the underwater platforms that we work with at Stevens. One of them is an ROV, a remotely operated vehicle called the Video Ray, which is a pretty widely used underwater platform. And we're trying to equip that with autonomous navigation capability and ultimately have it deploy from a WAM-V, an unmanned surface vessel, and with the goal of having both of these map complex structures above and below the ocean surface. However, on the ground vehicle side, we've worked mainly with the Clearpath Jackal, which is an electric unmanned ground vehicle, or UGV. I'll be using that acronym throughout the talk for the sake of brevity. This is, pretty small UGV, probably weighs about 50 pounds, and it runs for about 2 to 4 hours on a lithium polymer battery, depending on how intensive the navigation task is. And we work primarily with Lidar for the purposes of mapping, navigation, terrain traversability, and motion planning. And I'll talk about all of those things. One common thread with a lot of the recent work we've been doing is trying to see how we can use the tools of machine learning to enhance the capability of these autonomous navigation algorithms. And I'll talk a little bit about that toward the end. So first, a background. This is the main platform that we'll be focusing on today. So just to kind of introduce you to the Jackal and how we've outfitted it with sensors specifically. The Jackal is a robot research platform made by Clearpath Robotics. And we've instrumented it with 2 LiDAR sensors. One is a Hokuyo UTM30LX planar scanning LiDAR, which scans the plane out to about 30 meters. And we revolve this through 360 degrees on a servo motor. We use that for shorter range, higher resolution mapping. And at the rear here, we have a Velodyne Puck, a VLP-16, which is a pretty popular platform for autonomous vehicles research. It can see out to about 100 meters, but it has 16 beams oriented in the vertical, and those revolve through 360 degrees. And the Velodyne Puck is really the main sensor payload that I'll be talking about today. Just about everything that we do with Lidar odometry and traversability mapping and the motion planning that's aided by that just uses the Puck Lidar and a small embedded computer. Although the vehicle is equipped with an IMU, it does have wheel odometry available, and we do leverage Wi-Fi based comms as well for tasking and monitoring the vehicle. Another key point is that everything we do is supported by the Robot Operating System, ROS, which is a widely used set of software tools that provide a lot of the communication infrastructure for very rapid prototyping with autonomous robots. And so we're building on some existing support that I'll talk about a little bit later in the talk that already includes drivers for these sensors, a simulation of the vehicle, a good dynamic and kinematic model of the vehicle as well, and a lot of the communication infrastructure. And so much of our work involves supplying higher level algorithms that can interact with those utilities that ROS provides. So this is an outline of the topics that I'll go over today. Really, there are two main topics. One of them is efficient GPS-denied autonomous navigation that mainly makes use of the puck Lidar that I showed you on the previous slide, split up into three subtopics: Lidar odometry specifically, terrain traversability mapping, and then multi-objective motion planning that we can perform using those tools. And then the second topic I'll address is learning-enabled navigation, with a little bit of a different goal in mind, which is autonomous exploration. So how can we use machine learning to help a robot better explore a completely unknown environment and make good decisions about where it should collect its next sensor view? And we'll talk about how we do that from an information theory standpoint with the help of Gaussian processes, and then a little bit about deep learning as well and how we're leveraging that to do more intelligent autonomous exploration with this UGV. Okay, but first, one final comparison of working in the ground domain versus working in the underwater domain. So at left, you see real-time playback of our Jackal robot scanning with its puck Lidar, which sees out to about 100 meters. And we're getting very, very dense point clouds that are providing thousands of points that are very, very accurate, low noise. And there's enough overlap between consecutive scans that we're able to just perform scan matching of consecutive scans to localize the robot with centimeter scale precision. Then on the right-hand side, you can see some of the challenges we face with our underwater robot. We have a scanning sonar, which scans a lot more slowly. It takes about 8 seconds for the sonar to produce a full 360-degree scan. And in that time, the robot has incurred enough motion that there are errors in the scans themselves. They don't really represent a static snapshot of the environment. And so it's very hard to perform scan matching in the underwater case. However, for our UGV, we can make the assumption that every scan corresponds to one single robot position and orientation, and we can leverage that to do accurate Lidar odometry. So just taking one last look at the sensor that we'll be discussing for this first part of the talk, the Velodyne puck, which has a 30-degree vertical aperture with 16 beams, and it can see out to 100 meters. This is the computer that we've designed all the algorithms that involve this sensor to run on. This is an NVIDIA Jetson TX2 embedded computer, which is about the size of a credit card, and it costs about $500. So we have about an $8,000 Lidar, which is still relatively low cost as far as 3D volumetric scanning Lidar goes. And then we have about a $500 embedded computer. And our goal is to get everything to run just using that one sensor and that one embedded computer. So without further ado, we'll dive into the first subtopic here, which is what we call lightweight, ground-optimized LiDAR odometry and mapping, or LEGO LOM, which builds on a very, very popular, widely used, and highly successful algorithm developed at Carnegie Mellon University, first published in 2013, called LOM, LiDAR Odometry and Mapping. We've developed, that was a general use algorithm that could be applied to any sort of vehicle, ground, air, underwater. So we've developed a variant of that algorithm that's optimized for performance on ground vehicles, and it takes special advantage of the fact that ground vehicles usually have ground plane or something close to planar that can be used to perform better inference about the robot's location. Okay, so we'll go through the steps of our LEGO LOM LiDAR odometry algorithm, and I'll show you a few examples. So as you see here, there's kind of an involved sequence of steps going from projecting the LiDAR's point cloud as a range image, separating the ground, segmenting that point cloud, and using that segmentation to extract useful navigation features, matching one scan to the adjacent scan, and then occasionally, when time allows, matching scans to the entire map to get an even better position estimate. So this is the raw product from our Velodyne puck LiDAR. It's a point cloud. Actually, this is several point clouds overlaid atop one another, but this gives you an idea of the raw data product that we're working with. So the first step in processing this data product is we create what is called a range image. And we take all the points that are provided by this Lidar and we sort them into pixels, just in the way that the same way that they're provided to us from the Lidar itself, going into bins as a function of which beam or which channel they came from and which orientation that channel was in when the Lidar return was collected. So it looks a lot less square than this illustration does because we have very, very wide rows, and the columns are only 16 entries long, but we can still treat it as if it's an image whose contents are pixels for the purposes of doing processing. This is an example of what one individual scan looks like of those 16 channels out to 100 meters looking at a structure on the Stevens campus. So we take, as I mentioned, that raw point cloud and we project it into a range image. And the first goal that we have is just identifying the ground. So we'd like to separate the ground from this image. Again, this is something already that deviates a little bit from what the Carnegie-Mellon-Lohm algorithm does, only because that algorithm wasn't designed specifically for ground robots. So we're trying to take the best, build in some assumptions that are specific to ground robots to have an algorithm that's a little more computationally lightweight and optimized for performance in that ground vehicle setting. So to pick out the ground, we evaluate columns of the range image, and we use that to try to identify the slope among consecutive points along a column in order to indicate where the ground is located. Separating the ground also becomes useful later in the process of matching scans to one another and performing the optimization that gives us the rotation and translation between consecutive scans. And you can see here's an example of the ground plane extracted from this point cloud. The next step is cloud segmentation. So what we would like to do is essentially cluster this point cloud and try to extract features from this that can be useful for navigation and also represent points from the cloud that are in roughly the same geographical region of the environment. So we perform a breadth-first search on pixels throughout the image, and we try to basically use that in order to branch out to pixels in our range image that are in the same neighborhood and that are relatively close. So we don't search beyond a certain designated distance, and we kind of apply this iteratively throughout the image to try to cluster it and break it apart into areas that are in this areas of points that are within the same geographical region that could be used to represent features that could then be used for navigation and scan matching. So this is what a point cloud looks like after that segmentation is applied. We have this raw image at left, which you can see is very dense, very noisy as well. And so we try to extract just the most meaningful kind of contiguous clusters of points from that image that could be used as navigation features. And you can see here we get things that might be very easy to recognize and useful for navigation. We get the ground plane, and we get a bunch of edge features here, which are trees in this particular environment where the vehicle is driving through a forested area. Okay, and here's just another example of how that segmentation could be applied in a little bit less discriminatory manner to take the entire point cloud and running this breadth-first search iteratively through the whole point cloud will give you a segmentation that breaks it apart into clusters. And we can pick the very strongest features from those individual clusters. And that's what we perform. We perform a feature extraction step on those individual clusters that we've segmented the image into. And first we perform a row-wise evaluation to try to detect areas that have locally smoothness that are on either side of a particular desired threshold. So we're looking for two types of features, ones that are very smooth, which kind of represent the ground plane, and ones that are very rough, very jagged features that represent edges in the environment, like the pillars or columns of this building. So those are the rougher features we're trying to pull out of the imagery, and the ground plane represents the smoother end of features. So we do that by evaluating all the rows of the range image, performing this row-wise smoothness computation, and We take very, very smooth areas and designate them to be surface features. We take rough areas, and generally there's a different threshold applied to each. And the rough areas are designated to be edge features. So we would receive a point cloud like this as input, and as output we would generate hopefully the ground plane as our surface, and the columns of this building as the edges that would be used for features in the scan matching process. And so here's an example of applying those two different thresholds for smoothness and roughness, the surface features in pink and the edge features that we get from this image in green. And here they are completely filtered out from the rest of the surrounding scan. So we've taken a scan that initially consists of thousands of points, and we've reduced it down to tens of points, just making it a lot easier computationally for us to process the scan and perform many, many more individual instances of scan matching. So the next step is the scan matching process, where we try to take the features from the current scan and match them against the features from the previous scan to determine the translation and rotation that brings those two feature sets into the closest possible alignment. So it's an optimization step, and from that we get the translation and rotation of the robot itself while it's moving. So in a sense, this is why this scan matching process works very much like an odometry sensor, because by doing this, even though we're matching consecutive scans, we get an accurate, although gradually a drifting, estimate of how far the robot has moved and how its orientation has changed, much like an odometry sensor. Then finally, once in a while, not on every step, but every several steps, we also take the feature set from the current scan and we try to match it against an entire portion of the map that's comprised of a much larger set of features to obtain a more accurate and more sort of a bundle adjustment step to account for any errors that might have accumulated over these individual scan-to-scan steps. So this is kind of an overview of that whole process and what it looks like. So up here on the upper left, you have the original raw scan. Then you have our segmented scan that's clustered into areas that we hope will be strong candidates to be features, to become either surface or edge features. Then you have the features themselves that are extracted here. So again, this is a case where the UGV is being driven through a forested area. So you see kind of the forest floor, and then you see the various trees that are being detected as edge features. And then we can register the whole rest of our data on top of that and produce a complete 3D map with as much of the original data as we care to. And here's an example of the limitations of this. So this is a fairly accurate approach, but over the course of driving very long distances, we do build up drift just due to the fact that we're matching together just the adjacent scans and only occasionally performing a bundle adjustment step. So over the course of driving in this 2.5 kilometer loop through a forested area in New Jersey, this is the entire data set, all of the LiDAR points that we gathered over the course of driving along that trail. But it doesn't align perfectly. So when we come back to the exact location where we started, you can see that a little bit of error has built up between where we started here and the estimate of where the robot's located at the end. So this is still a pretty small amount of drift over the course of a 2.5 kilometer traversal, but it's not perfect. And we certainly can make global type corrections that can correct these kind of errors. And this is how we do that. So we implement a method that's been widely used throughout robotics for several decades now, simultaneous localization and mapping, or SLAM, where we try to detect what is known as a loop closure, basically recognizing when the robot is back in a place that it has been before. And so instead of just matching consecutive scans, we try to take the most recent scan and match it against locations that we were at and we were observed much earlier in the traversal, right? So if we can identify that robot pose X1 and robot pose XI from the future saw some overlapping information, we can use that constraint to make a global correction to that trajectory and account for that drift that occurred in the previous slide. So this is an overview of the whole process, and it's a bit of a long video, so I'll skip through to some of the highlights. Okay, so this is our Jackal robot driving through the Stevens campus. Equipped only with the Velodyne Puck LiDAR, and It has both an i7 processor and a Jetson embedded computer, and we have tested our algorithm on both, although in most cases you'll see it running here on the Jetson. And we're comparing this algorithm to the state-of-the-art, the original Loam algorithm, which uses the entire LiDAR scan and is not as discriminatory about the types of features that it uses. So this is the original Loam algorithm, which again is generalized. So it's not designed specifically for ground vehicles. It could be used for aircraft, for any system that's performing ranging. This is our Lego Loam lightweight version of the algorithm, and you can see that there's a much smaller number of points from the original raw LiDAR scan that are being used for the purposes of navigation. In addition to being lightweight computationally, there are other advantages to that as well. One of them being when you're limited with respect to the type of process here that you can use, running an algorithm like this is very computationally intensive, and also using every single point in the point cloud for the purposes of scan matching can introduce errors, since there can be a lot of noise in some of those points, and they might represent things like grass, brush, plants that are blowing around in the wind, and they might not be the most stable features. And that's what's happening here, is that you can see the same tree is being produced several times just due to the fact that there's some misalignment in the scans that are being matched against one another. So on the left here is the original Loam algorithm, which again is working with a much larger number of points, and it's a bit running up against the wall computationally. And you can see some errors are being introduced into the scan matching process as a result of that. Here's our lightweight algorithm running both on the Jetson embedded computer and an Intel i7. And it's managing to maintain a pretty accurate estimate of where the robot's traveling as we drive it around our campus. And the visual image you see over here, this is just collected from a GoPro. The visual imagery is not used in any way to aid the navigation process here. It's just there for the basis of comparison. And again, you can see that a lot of misalignment ends up being introduced into the maps produced by the original LiDAR odometry method due to the fact that there are a lot of noisy features that are being used in that scan matching process, features from the grass, for example, on relatively flat ground. Here's another data set where we drive through the Stevens campus, and you can see a comparison between the original LiDAR odometry method and our lightweight LiDAR odometry method. Although in this case, both managed to produce a pretty accurate trajectory estimate of where the vehicle was being driven. And we'll eventually drive back to the location on campus where we started, and there'll be pretty minimal drift throughout that process. Okay. So they're both working pretty well here. This is another scenario where we drive across our campus again, but some portion of it includes driving over a field that's mostly grass and has only a few trees. And one thing that happens is that the original LiDAR odometry method ends up being snagged a little bit by the fact that there are many, many features from the grass in a relatively flat area that are being pulled in as navigation features and result in some inaccurate scan matching. So here, this trajectory estimate begins to diverge and errors accumulate due to the fact that there just are not enough features to support this process. Here, we're only using the very best features. We're being very selective about which ones we pull in to the scan matching process, and we don't incur that error. And eventually, we manage to drive back toward where we started, and the total error accumulated is pretty small. Okay. And then the final scenario I'll show you is the same trail that's 2.5 kilometers where we go around in a loop around the whole trail. So we end right where we started. So it's pretty clear how much error has built up during the LiDAR odometry process. So this is the original LiDAR odometry algorithm running on an i7 just to give it the best chance possible of accurate estimation. But you can see there's a lot of misalignment at the end compared to the lightweight algorithm we're proposing. And so we've run this multiple times and done 10 trials of each method. And you can see the original algorithm ends up in 10 different places just because it's very computationally constrained and it's not able to use every LiDAR scan in order to perform in real time. And the last thing I'll show you is just running our algorithm over a very widely used autonomous driving data set, the KITTI data set, collected at Karlsruhe Institute of Technology in Germany, just showing the fact that not only can we help track the location of a car as it drives through this urban area in that data set, we can also perform the loop closures that I was talking about earlier and make these global corrections to how far the robot has drifted when it's relying just on odometry. So here's a case where it comes back to a place it's been before. There's a little bit of misalignment, but then we're able to make a correction, and there the map has been corrected. So in the interest of time, I think I'll keep moving forward, and I'll get to this topic, scan-by-scan terrain traversability mapping. And that was the longest of all of these topics, so just because we had the most video results to show you. So using this very same data, right, we would also like the robot to take an active role and be able to make decisions about where to drive, not just be driven remotely and be able to localize itself. So the next step there is building a representation of the environment that the robot can plan over. And to do that, we build traversability maps using the same LiDAR data through a series of steps involving, once again, processing of the range image, filtering the point cloud, registering the map, and performing path planning. So there's a few different filters that we apply to the range image this time that are a little bit different. One of them is a filter on the columns of the range image that's looking specifically for changes in slope. And if the slope angle is too large, then we know that there's an issue with traversability and the robot probably cannot drive over an area that's prohibitively steep. So here's an example of that. We can tune this threshold for how high a slope is permissible. And you can see if we set it to 20 degrees, it thinks this hillside is too steep. If we set it to 40 degrees, it thinks that this hillside is traversable. So this can be tuned depending on the setting and the vehicle's capabilities. We also perform row-wise filtering with the goal of detecting curbs. So looking at areas that have monotonic changes in the range value, but also have very large changes in range across those intervals, that also helps us to detect curbs. And here's an example of those put together. The slope filter and the curb filter allow us to do this in a scan-by-scan manner. So what makes our traversability mapping framework a little unique is the fact that it's doing this on every scan as the scan arrives and fusing that information with the previous information. There's no larger scale optimization that needs to be performed here. We're just doing this one scan at a time upon arrival. And as a result, we're able to tile the environment and map areas that we know to be traversable and areas that appear to be non-traversable, like the curbs and obstacles that you see in this image. And the robot can use that for planning. The other thing is that we represent this tiled environment at multiple height levels for the purpose of representing things like multi-level parking garages where there might be traversable terrain in the same XY location at different heights. So it's capable of capturing that. And this is an example of what a multi-level parking garage would look like, represented using this traversability mapping framework, where we've driven the robot up to the top of the parking garage, and it can successfully flag all the areas that would be non-traversable. Now, for the purpose of making all this compatible with ROS, the robot operating system, as I mentioned, what we do is we take the 3D traversability map that I showed you, and then we write out a 2D submap, and this 2D map is shipped directly to ROS, and the ROS navigation stack can then be used for all of the low-level planning and control. So this is the map that the robots, that all of the utilities running in ROS are able to use to make decisions about low-level control and keeping the robot to the desired trajectory. So we don't have to design our own low-level controllers for this system. And we can also perform motion planning on top of this traversability map. That's the desired end goal. So here's an example of us using what's called a probabilistic road map. So we just create this interconnected graph that spans over the whole traversable area of the environment, which we can use as a construct for path planning. And here's an example of what all the different pieces look like put together. Here's the raw Velodyne point cloud as we're driving through our campus. Here's what it looks like as it's filtered scan by scan into traversable and non-traversable points. Here's what those points look like when they're tiled into a traversability map that's represented at a resolution that we specify. And then this is what our path planning construct looks like as we generate that over the traversable portions of the map. And finally, I'll just show you a quick video clip that shows how this works once we have a large enough map that we can generate a long distance plan over it. So here the robot has planned a path for it to get back to the start of our campus, and it's tracking its progress along the trajectory and continually making revisions because it may occasionally detect obstacles that were not visible earlier or that have moved. And it uses plan revision and eventually gets to the goal. So future work. Here, all the assumptions we made about slopes and curbs assumed that they're all up and above the location of the robot itself, which was driving in the street, right? But there may be cases where the robot itself is going from the street to the sidewalk, into and outside of buildings, up onto a trail, and back into the road. And so we need to be able to make more generalized assumptions about how the environment may be sloped and what indicates traversability versus non-traversability, because there may be some cases where you want to stay on the sidewalk and you need to take into account that the road will be sloped downward from you. Okay, and I'll speak briefly about the types of motion planning that we're doing over these representations. So, we were inspired by some of the recent work that's been done to simulate driving scenarios where you may have to violate the rules occasionally, just due to certain constraints in the environment. So this was a paper from 2013 from MIT on what's called minimum violation motion planning. So an example here is if a car is driving along trying to obey the rules of the road, and there's an obstruction in your lane, and then again later on, how do I get to the goal while violating the rules to the minimal extent possible? So here the robot does decide to go into the opposite lane of traffic, but for as briefly as possible before it goes back into its own lane. This can be tuned, however, right? And the aggressiveness of the robot can be a trade-off, right? Where you might get additional efficiency here. I have a shorter or lower energy path, but I'm also violating the rules a little bit worse, right? I'm not going back into the lane only to depart from it a second time. Here, I go into the opposite lane and I stay there until I get to the goal, just in the interest of saving energy, right? So there are interesting multi-objective trade-offs that come into play when you have multiple rules like this, and the rules might have different priorities, right? Staying on the correct direction of traffic flow is probably more important than keeping outside of the passing lane when you're not passing, right? Maybe both of those are less important than driving off the road or onto the sidewalk. So there might be many instances, though, where we can identify the priority of these rules, and we can identify when they apply and when they don't. Maybe I receive my penalty only when I'm outside of the correct lane, and that's applied and penalizes the path until the robot goes back into the correct lane. So this framework in this original paper uses a very sophisticated formal logic framework for capturing these constraints, and we're looking at ways we could possibly represent this a little more efficiently using algorithms that are amenable to running on our Jetson embedded PC. So as I mentioned, there are a few different ways you could solve a multi-objective optimization problem. You could take all your different costs and give them different weights, additive weights that sum against one another. Maybe you impose each one as a constraint and you try to find a solution that obeys all of your constraints. Like the original paper I mentioned, though, we take an approach called lexicographic optimization, where we rank all of our cost functions in order of importance, and we hope that we can find an algorithm that just solves that one problem as defined and gives us the best solution in the order that our cost functions are ranked. So here's an example of how that might be formulated. Perhaps for this robot that's goal is to stay on the sidewalk and navigate among pedestrians, number one goal is to stay out of traffic. Maybe the number two goal is to avoid an adversarial threat over here. Maybe the number three goal is to stay outside the comfort range of these pedestrians. Number four is to maintain comms with these beacons over here. And number five, if possible, minimize the distance traveled. And so we can rank all of these, minimize them in order, and when all things are equal, we can break our ties using the lower ranked cost functions. And so this is amenable to very fast solution using Monte Carlo style sampling based algorithms that generate constructs like the one you see here, which is a tree that can be grown using samples, random samples that are gradually added into the tree and wired into the tree, taking these cost functions into account to get a solution that actually addresses this problem optimally in the order that the cost functions are ranked. So here's an example of us doing this with the goal of minimizing a robot's localization uncertainty. Let's imagine here our robot's just navigating through this simple 2D environment. Here you see the shortest path. The robot's just taking a straight line path from the start here at the origin to the goal at the upper right corner. What you see colorized here is the localization uncertainty of this robot. So as the robot navigates using a noisy odometry process, gradually its uncertainty accumulates, and that's what the red color indicates here. What we have at the left is we inserted a region where there's the availability of GPS or some other accurate sensing resource that can knock out all of that drift, and that's why the color is green here. The robot can drive into this region and zero out all that error. So this type of sampling-based algorithm is amenable to the type of solution you see on the right. This is a Monte Carlo procedure that grows the optimal solution as the number of samples increases. And you can see eventually we find a solution that minimizes these three costs in order. First, it minimizes the robot's max uncertainty. And as soon as it's possible for that robot to collect a GPS measurement, it does. Then it minimizes the amount of time it spends outside the GPS region. And you can see once it hits this region, it kind of loiters in there for a while, so it doesn't have to incur any additional drift. Then third and finally, it minimizes its distance traveled outside the GPS region. And you can see then it takes a straight line path to the goal. So by ranking our cost functions in this order, we can produce a Monte Carlo planning algorithm that basically grows a solution that ranks all of these costs in order without having to leverage any of the formal logic tools that are used in the previous approach. In the interest of time, I think I'll skip over the details of the algorithm. Just show you a few more applications. Here's an example of us actually using this on our UGV. So here's a case where the Jackal robot is trying to localize using the measurement of features in the environment. But in this region, it doesn't have it can't range to any of these features. So it's forced to drift, and you can see that its localization error increases. So the lexicographic algorithm allows us to prioritize these two costs and stay within range of all the useful navigation features while also minimizing distance as a second priority. Here's the algorithm I showed you on the previous slide used to plan through this GPS region. And we can also use this, as you see here, to plan around threats. So here we assume being at a high altitude is akin to being at a very high risk or level of exposure to threats. And so the robot should stay below a certain designated altitude, and then when all things are equal, plan the shortest path possible. And here you can see it plans around these high altitude regions and then goes to the goal, minimizing the amount of time it spends in those regions. So that's an example of how we can employ a very lightweight and efficient algorithm for multi-objective planning over the types of constructs that I showed you there. And then the last topic that I'll discuss today is learning-enabled navigation. And this aims at a slightly different problem. This problem we call autonomous exploration. So the assumption is that the robot has no knowledge of the contents of its environment, and its goal is to explore the environment as efficiently as possible and build a complete map. And we'll talk about two ways that we approach that using tools from machine learning. So here's another example of how our work on this problem was inspired by our work with underwater robots. So in the world of underwater robotics, we might have very sparse information to describe the environment around us. And it may also be very noisy. So we sometimes have very incomplete, very patchy descriptions of what's around us. It's very different from the world of Lidar that has dense descriptive information of everything. So what you see here is a typical grid map that we might construct with our underwater robot when it's driving around mapping with its sonar. We've seen a few structures. We have accurate but somewhat noisy models that capture them. This is a corrugated seawall. These are some pilings of a pier. This is a portion of a ship hull. But we don't have a perfect model of what's in the surrounding environment. And we'd like to make decisions about how to explore as efficiently as possible. So this represents what we call a frontier, a construct that could be used to drive the robot into the unknown regions and make the most efficient decisions possible. So working in this setting is what motivated our work on this problem. But this is also a challenging problem if a ground vehicle is mapping in 3D. Even if it's using very dense, high-precision LiDAR data, it's mapping very complex environments with structures that might be occluded, and it might be non-trivial to decide where the robot needs to go to get a complete map of the entire environment. But the problem is, we're really no longer on the sparse data end of the spectrum. We're really living with dense data, in the case of our UGV. And deciding where to explore is very computationally intensive. So, we have to be able to project the robot's sensor into all the different possible configurations we may want to drive it next, make projections about what the Lidar beams are going to intersect, and draw conclusions about which configuration will be the most informative. And that can be very computationally intensive. So here's an example of how we visualize that to make a decision and kind of treat this like an optimization problem. So here we assume our robot is sitting at the corner of this hallway and it's looking out, trying to decide where to travel next to continue gathering information. And we assume that we're mapping using a grid map like the kind I showed you on the previous slide, and that every single grid cell is essentially a unit of information that we're kind of adding up like points and trying to continue mapping in a way that every consecutive sensor view gives us the largest amount of new information possible, so collects the largest number of unobserved grid cells possible. And this field here represents where we expect we're going to get the largest amount of new information. So if we stay in the corner, we're not going to see anything new, but if we drive to the ends of the hallway here, the robot's anticipated to collect a large amount of new information, and that's what the red represents here. However, as I mentioned, this is very computationally intensive, and if we want to do this in real time for maybe several robots that have very dense volumetric scanning LiDAR, we need to find a way to perform this optimization efficiently. So we're using Gaussian processes in this instance, and only looking at a few points rather than the entire field of possible sensing actions. We apply Gaussian process regression over this set of points, and we try to reconstruct this information field. And on the right, you see the reconstruction we built using Gaussian process regression over these few initial points. So at the end of the day, most of the computational workload being done here is only being applied to these few points, and the regression, which can be implemented very efficiently, is doing the rest. So that's been helpful. We've been able to make it even more effective using a technique called Bayesian Optimization, which is essentially a way to maximize an unknown function, and a function that's very, very expensive to evaluate. So this is a procedure that helps us decide where we should take our next sample to continue working to estimate and maximize this function. Now, in our case, this is our function. The function is the information content that we estimate we're going to observe at different robot sensing actions. And that helps us choose where to collect these samples. So one by one, we can collect these samples very efficiently by taking the sample that will give us the best trade-off between discovering what the function really looks like and trying to maximize this function at the same time. So here's an example of that running on our Jackal UGV. So here we took the Jackal and we drove it around, again, a park environment that looks a little bit like a forest. And step by step, the Jackal is gathering a few samples, doing an exhaustive computational geometry evaluation of what all the sensor beams are likely to see, but only doing it for a few points, performing a Gaussian process regression, and then trying to choose the best place to drive in all of continuous space to continue exploring and collecting informative sensor views. And as it navigates gradually, it manages to map the entire forested area. I'll skip ahead a little bit in the interest of time and show you the complete map that's emerging here. And here's an example of doing this in a naive manner where we just kind of choose our samples. We choose a random collection of samples and pick the best one. Here where we choose our samples using Bayesian optimization. And this robot is able to map the environment more efficiently. This is just a qualitative comparison, but in some of our papers on this topic, we've done quantitative comparisons in different settings. And this is all run on a small ground robot platform called the TurtleBot. This is just an indoor robot, which is just basically a vacuum cleaner with a depth camera attached to it. And we're using that to explore our lab. So this is just a simple indoor environment. But this was a good test bed for us developing and testing these algorithms. And we've released this exploration algorithm as a ROS package. So if you have a TurtleBot or you work with a TurtleBot, you can download our software package and use this to explore unknown environments using the TurtleBot's depth camera. And you can see the Bayesian optimization approach kind of has the edge at this point. It's making more efficient decisions that reveal larger amounts of new information, so the robot's able to map the entire environment more efficiently and gradually map the entire contents of the lab. Okay, and the very last topic I was going to discuss today, deep learning. So deep learning has been having a huge impact throughout robotics and also in the self-driving vehicle sector as well. When you have data, that well represents the task you're trying to solve, learning from that data may very well do better than the classical algorithms for optimizing and discovering the best policy to follow. So in our case, we're trying to see if that applies to this problem of autonomous exploration. So I'll preface this by saying we have not yet had an opportunity to run this outdoors on our Jackal UGV with the real Lidar. This is all simulated data, where part of the constraint was we needed a very, very large database of training data to try to train a deep neural network. So in order to collect that, we worked with these randomly generated maps. So we kind of looked for starters at a 2D simulated environment where we have these video game inspired dungeon maps. And we can generate many, many thousands of these at random. They all have similar characteristics like the length scales, the width of the corridor, the sensor radius associated with the robot, but their topology differs and the exact layout of the map differs every time. So we try to see if we train the robot on enough of these, whether we can teach the robot how to explore, and the robot might, some policies for exploring an unknown environment might emerge that are as good or better than the information-based approach that I discussed earlier. And so we've looked at two different ways to do this. One is through supervised learning, where we give the robot labeled images that are telling it what to do, that tell it what the most informative immediate action is to take, and also reinforcement learning, where the robot discovers on its own the best policy, because for every action it chooses, it receives a score, and that reward signal will eventually teach the robot how to act optimally. Reinforcement learning approaches also can converge optimally, but they tend to take many, many, many more trials. To give you an idea of the difference between these two frameworks, the supervised learning case, where we tell the robot what to do in its training, takes about 200,000 instances of training, and the reinforcement learning case takes about 2 million instances of training in order to converge. We'll start with the supervised case, though. So as I mentioned, we generate a very large number of maps. Here we generate about 10,000 maps randomly using this framework. Then from those, we gather sets of training samples. So there are about 200,000 training samples in total that are used here. And what these represent are individual views that the robot has at any given point in time while it's exploring these environments. So as the robot it starts out not knowing the contents of this map, and it has to explore. And as it explores, it has locally views that look something like this, right? And so the robot is given these views of an exploration in progress, and it has to decide where to go next. And when we train it, we give it labeled images like these. And so it's learning from these labeled images in the same way that you would train a classifier to learn from visual images that you gathered from the internet. And so in doing that, we worked with some of the most successful deep neural nets that have been used in image classification challenges, and we got the best performance out of GoogleNet. However, still not perfect, and definitely there's a long way to go. So GoogleNet, after all this training, chose the best action 70% of the time. It chose an action in the top 5 out of about 50 choices, 97, 98% of the time. However, this doesn't quite meet the bar for the robot to autonomously explore without any human intervention, because if it chooses a good action 98% of the time, and it has to choose many, many, many actions in sequence, right, the likelihood of making a poor decision is going to grow, and eventually the robot will steer off course. And the very last thing I'll show you is the reinforcement learning approach, which, as I mentioned, takes a long time to converge. It takes about 2 million instances of decision making, sending the robot the reward signal to learn an effective policy. And I'll just play this video clip, which is the very last slide, that shows you how this works. So as I mentioned, we train the robot using these randomly generated maps. The robot at any given time can see a local snapshot of those maps, and it has to choose which one of these actions to take, and it has an action space that's pretty finely discretized. So here's an example of 3 different test maps. The robot was not trained on these maps. These are completely new. The robot hasn't seen them before. And this is just going to show you how the robot performs on these maps with varying amounts of training. So one thing that happens, right, is the robot can get stuck in a dead end. Because this isn't a path planning algorithm per se, it's really just an exploration algorithm. And we're teaching the robot how to gather the largest amount of new information. So anytime the robot gets stuck, we assist it, and that's indicated with a red line segment. So the red line segment really indicates how much rescuing does the robot need from the policy that it's learned just purely through reinforcement learning. So here's an example. After 20,000 iterations of learning, the robot still needs a lot of rescuing over all three of these maps, and it really isn't making very efficient decisions, as you could see. Now we have about 100,000 training epochs, and it's getting a little bit better, but it still needs a lot of intervention. Now 400,000, and we're getting closer. Fewer instances of rescuing were needed there. And finally, after 2 million training instances, the robot is able to navigate through the map without assistance. Okay, and I'll conclude also by acknowledging the PhD students who contributed to this work. Everything you saw in the lightweight navigation component was done by Tishao Shan as part of his PhD work, and the learning-enabled autonomous exploration by Shibai and Frankie Chen. And this work has been supported in part by the National Science Foundation. So thanks for your attention today, and I would be happy to take any questions that you have.
Questions from folks here in class, and then we'll also invite people who are off in the internet land to provide their questions through the chat, and Shannon will read those to us.
So in the case of autonomous driving on a road, you have both a known map and also all the cars on the road and the other obstacles that are unknown. Is that an easier problem compared to?
That's a good question. I guess if you have some structure that you already know, you have a prior map, or you have some knowledge of how the environment is structured that you can take into account here, you could certainly take a more specialized approach that would give you better solutions. This is kind of a totally unstructured approach, and so you probably saw some of the path planning solutions that were chosen over those environments were a little curvy and somewhat randomized looking. So I think if you could add that structure into the problem, you probably could get better solutions and probably solve the problems more efficiently as well if you have that info available. Here we made generalized assumptions that we might be driving off the road into a forested area, into or out of buildings. But I think we could leverage more of that structure if we knew the robot was going to be working in a specific setting. Yeah.
I kind of understand why you would use this for underwater exploration, because so much of the ocean is unexplored. But for terrestrial purposes, what kind of exploration do you think this could be used for?
One thing that we imagine could be something like surveying a forested environment. Like if you wanted to gather information about the state of an environment within a specific bounding region, and it's kind of laborious for humans to continually go out and survey, you might be able to just like you do with the underwater robot, draw out a bounding box, say, go take a look at this entire region, come back with a 3D map, and then a human potentially could be looking at that data set for anything anomalous, or you could also at the same time be screening that data for something anomalous. So it could be useful in a region like that. That maybe we have some recorded information, but to a large extent it's still unstructured. That's what we were thinking here. Sending robots out into the wilderness where it's a little more costly and laborious to send people. Yeah.
So in your reinforcement learning for the exploration, what was your reward essentially just one until you couldn't move anymore, or how did you deal with it?
So the reward was a function of how much information the robot gathered with every action. Okay. So yeah, if it did crash or it collected if it collected nothing, it would just get a reward of 0. If it crashed, it would get a negative reward. And if it saw something new, it would get a reward that's a function of how much it saw.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. And then for the reinforcement, when you discretize those actions, was it essentially a spin, move, stop, search again, or how were those actions actually?
Yeah, they were just one-step action where the robot drove forward at a specific heading angle. So it was a pretty small action space with about 50 individual actions for any given decision-making step.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes?
The feature extraction that you were doing, so if you have, instead of 16, if you had 32 channels,
Yeah.
you get better features. And
Yeah. Yeah,
How sensitive is the feature extraction for the SLAM?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. We are, most of the results that I showed you were operating in feature-rich environments, admittedly, not on, highways that had relatively little surrounding features. The resolution, if you had higher resolution, it would definitely improve what you could get out of this. At the same time, however, it would introduce additional computational burden. So I think that would, if we doubled the number of beams, we'd probably be pushing our Jetson to the limit. I don't know if the Jetson could handle it, but we also were doing this on an Intel i7, like a high-end processor you'd have on a laptop. That could probably handle 32 beams. But as you go to 64 or 128, you might be pushing the limit. So yeah, our goal was trying to get the best performance we could in real time. But admittedly, yeah, we were working on the lower resolution end of the spectrum with 16 channels. Other
We
questions?
still have, we don't have anybody on the chat box, so that gives you another minute or
Okay.
two.
To the point about reinforcement learning, one thing I should also mention with regard to that is our interest is really trying to scale that up as well to higher dimensional action spaces, three-dimensional data, which is something that's currently in progress. Our hope with that is that even if the training is very intensive, that we can do the training in a simulated manner, hopefully a distributed manner, and we're really, what's really appealing to us there is that the query time of one of these neural networks is very, very cheap. So if we manage to train a network, even if it's trained exhaustively, querying it could be a constant time operation, and still, at runtime, this could run a lot more efficiently and be a lot more scalable than a classical algorithm could.
You're saying it could continuously be moving and training within like one of its cycles?
Well, I'm thinking more that there's a training phase. We train it to the extent that we're happy that the policy is converged, and then we just query that policy and don't add anything further to it. Sure. Only because for the reinforcement learning part, we need so many trials that the training would probably have to happen in simulation.
Right. Yeah. Transferring that to the real world.
Yeah.
It's a little tricky.
Yeah, absolutely.
I noticed during your mapping that all of the terrain were very static. Do you have any way of mapping moving the terrain?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we started out developing these algorithms, testing them in static environments, and if the environment became so dynamic that maybe you have people moving, you were in a very pedestrian-filled environment, you might have to have a separate step where pre-processing the data, you would have to detect, classify, and segment out the moving obstacles so you didn't use them as navigation features. But if, for example, a car or another obstacle drives into the way, this would capture it. You may decide, depending on the context, whether or not you need to segment that out and treat it separately.
I'm going to have to stop. By the way, we have this room for another 30 minutes, so if people here in the room want to ask more questions, you're more than welcome to. I just want to let you all know that 1 week from today, we will have Frank Dama presenting, and he'll be talking on towards greater understanding of the relationship between public perceptions of speed, speed laws, and safety. So totally different topic, related more to policy than technology, but also fits within the how shall I put it, the scope of the breadth of topics that we cover in this seminar series. So tune in again next week, same time, same place, or visit us here in the room. And like I said, those of you here can stay for another 30 minutes and ask your questions. But we're signing off on the web connection. And so thank you very much for attending. And again, those of you who want to stick around, you're more than welcome to do that. Thank you. Let's thank our speakers again.
Can I tell you communicating with your underwater ground vehicle?
Yeah, the underwater vehicle is actually a tethered vehicle.
Oh, it's tethered.
Yeah, so everything's just being fed from the tether to our laptops on the shore.
Do you worry, especially in a river, about getting snagged on something?
Yeah. Although, I'll be honest, I'm worried less about that than about losing a tetherless robot. It's a bit of a trade-off. But yeah, it can get snagged, so we have to be very careful about that, not letting out too much of it, or trying to keep track of it.